Awesome. Does anybody want to open with prayer? As everyone volunteers at once.
You asked right as I took a big bite of food.
Yeah. I want to see your seafood.
All right, I'll pray.
Sweet.
Father, thank you for the opportunity to fellowship digitally here. I thank you for the blessing, the privilege of receiving some of the insights and revelations that Grace has learned there at camp. I ask you to open our eyes and our ears and our hearts to receive what you are saying to us today. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. So, basically what I want to talk about, this kind of like new concept that that they've been talking about, is that I feel like we have this idea, like, I don't know if anybody else has this idea, but for some reason I grew up like in the church having this idea that somehow like Jesus has an advantage, right? Like that Jesus had, like it was easier for Jesus, that he had an advantage over us because, he's God, right? So like when he was living on earth, that it was easier for him to live the life that he lived than it is for us, obviously, because he's God and we're not. Does that basically sound pretty true of what you guys had conceptualized, or like have that feeling?
I might have kind of grown up with it a bit, but I would say that overall, I don't know, personally, I forget where it is, but the Bible says that he was tempted in every way the same that we are, so I guess I just kind of took that literally and was like, oh, okay, so he was human. He went through the same things we did. I guess pretty much I would just see it as more of like looking back on it from the perspective of what I've been learning over the past month or two. I think he had a bit more of that accurate realization of what his true identity was from the very beginning. And I think he pretty much really got it back when he was at the temple for the first time.
So you're cutting to the chase here for me then. But
okay, I'll be quiet.
No, it's good. Like, okay, so like I've said before I've heard people say a couple times before, like I would be like, oh, Jesus, he lived a perfect life and he like had all this faith and like he lived without sin, and people are like, yeah, but that was Jesus. Like we've heard that kind of like that mentality of like, oh well, yeah, Jesus did that because that's Jesus, but like obviously we can't because we're not him. You know what I mean? Like, have you ever heard like that kind of sentiment? Yes, no?
Yeah, I don't know if it was strong, but I've probably heard it here and there because it's registering. Yeah. And I'm kind of with like what Ben was saying, is I feel like if I did think he had an advantage, I think it was maybe that he knew who he was sooner than we do. So there's a little bit. Is that
the idea that you were like grew up with, or that you have now? That's what I'm asking.
Probably a little bit of both, because I guess I've never actually really been like, nobody's ever brought it up to challenge it, right? So
Stephen, what about you? I'm curious.
Yeah, like before I started learning about the gospel, like from you and stuff like that, like I did feel like he did have an advantage, because like just his relationship with God and how he said like God is like inside, he was part God. But now that we've been learning like God lives in us, he's living his life through us and all that.
I'm not worried about what you know now. Like I want to know like what you like knew before, like what we were.
Yeah, that's what I thought. He was like, okay, well, he's obviously part God. He's got something, like he's doing miracles. He knows, like when he was baptized, God said, "This is my beloved son." All that. So.
Yeah, so like I don't know, maybe I don't know how I got this idea, but I know a lot of people I've talked to before also have this idea that like, we're called to be Christians and live like a Christian life, but like we make excuses for the way that we fail, because we're like, oh well, we're imperfect, we're we're not, we're sinners, or like, we're not God. Jesus was able to do that because he was the son of God type of thing. So like just kind of like placing Jesus at like this higher level of advantage than we were.
Yeah,
And
like he didn't have a sinful nature. Like I felt like he didn't have a sinful nature, and we did. But like that was before I learned about the gospel from you. That
yes.
we're new creations. So like I was like, well, he didn't have a sinful nature. So like I thought he was like, you know, a second Adam. Like, you know how Adam didn't have a sinful nature at first and he failed. So like he could have still failed like Adam did, but like he didn't start with a sinful nature. You know what I mean?
So some of the stuff that we were talking about in camp for worship was just like going more in depth on like Jesus and like his divinity and his humanity and like how to reconcile that and like the implications of it. So like there are some Christian circles that focus a lot on Jesus's humanity, and there's a lot of other like ideas that focuses like too much on Jesus's divinity, where or like if you give too much credence to like his divinity, then it becomes like, okay, well he was God and like we're not, so obviously he's able to do those things and we're not, right? And then like focusing on his humanity too much, it kind of strips him of his like of his divine stature, and like people kind of like look at him more of like a prophet and a good person, you know what I'm saying? So like elevating either one of those causes problems. But like some of the things they brought up in the camp worship that I thought was really interesting was like, for some reason I had this thought in my mind, and I don't know where this came from, or like, you know, because like our presuppositions, we don't really know that we have them. It's kind of like background until someone points it out and like, hey, where did that come from? Then you're like, oh, I don't know. So like I kind of always had this idea in my mind that like Jesus and God the Father are like chilling up in heaven having a powwow, and they're like, hey, you know, we're gonna have this plan for salvation, and you're gonna go down as a baby, and you know you're gonna, you know, live this life, and you're gonna know that you're really the son of God, and you're gonna do all these miracles, and you're gonna die on the cross, you're gonna save everyone. And he's like, okay, cool, got it. And so he goes as a baby, as like an undercover agent type of thing. Like he knows he's God, but he's secretly like a human to blend in, and like he knows the whole time that that's his mission and that's his plan. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like that's kind of like what I had in my mind. But then like that causes some serious problems of like, if you follow that thinking and like that's what you believe, because that's honestly what I believed, like without really thinking about it, it's like, okay, if he had like previous knowledge of like who he was, like if he knew like and had memories of like him being up in heaven with the Father, and like knew what his plan was like as an infant, like that would have put him at an advantage, right, over us, because it would have been like he wouldn't have required any faith on his part, right, because he already knew. Does that make sense? And so like
Yeah.
it wouldn't have been hard for him to like do those things if he knows who he is. Like the temptation when Jesus went into the wilderness and the devil was attacking him, saying like, if you are the son of God, turn these stones into bread, right? That wouldn't be like a temptation if he knew like who he was, right? It'd be like saying like, hey Grace, if you're really Grace, do this. I'd be like, well, I know that that's me. Like that's not like, I'm not gonna be like, oh man, like am I me? Like am I really me? Like I'll have an existential crisis. Like no, like if it wouldn't only be a temptation if like if he didn't know. Does that make sense? Like he
Yeah.
knew through belief, right? Like he knew, like in the worship that they were giving us, they were saying like, I was like, well then how did God know, or how did Jesus know that who he was if he didn't just know from like before his previous memories? And he was like, he read the Bible, realized it was talking about him, and believed. And I was like, wait, so you're saying that Jesus was able to do everything that he did because of belief? And everyone just kind of laughed, and I was like, what? Like, because that's crazy. Like, you know, like that amount of faith is crazy.
But it makes sense to the fact that why that's the biggest pretty much command in the Bible is believe, because if you don't, you have absolutely nothing.
Yeah. So you know
So
how
he
we
had to have more faith than any of us did, because he had to like take that big leap of faith that he was, you know, actually the Messiah. None
yeah,
of us
so
have
like,
to take that big of a leap of faith.
I'm sorry?
None of us have to take that much of a big leap of faith to think that we're the Messiah based on the prophecies.
He had to have more faith than we did, really.
Yeah.
And so like it makes sense because Jesus is referred to as the second Adam, right? To restore the failings of the first Adam. And the failings of the first Adam was of unbelief, right? Like he didn't believe what God said. Instead, he chose to listen to his wife and the serpent and believe what they said, right? So the Adam's first failing was unbelief, right? About like, what God said. So like Jesus comes and he has the faith when we didn't have faith. Like he succeeds in the place that we failed. The Bible talks a lot about like God, Jesus's faithfulness and the faith of Jesus, and it's like I thought that they were just talking about like his faithfulness to us, like how he's like devoted and committed to us, but it's like literally we are saved like through the faith of Jesus because he had faith, right? And like was able to live the life that he lived as a demonstration of like what's available for us if we believe the same way, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, and then, I was thinking and I was like, well, Jesus had like this special relationship with the Father. He must have had like, memories of him like, chilling up in heaven. Like it would be like if I'm in Hawaii right now, right? But like I have a relationship with my mom because like I used to live with her. So like we're able to like have a relationship, a super good one, like via like talking on the phone and texting. But because I have a previously established relationship of us being together like in the same house, like the God and Jesus being in heaven, and then like Jesus comes to earth, like me being in Hawaii, so there's like a distance between us. But I would have a better relationship with my mom than like some random other person here at Camp would because they don't know her the way I do. Does that make sense? So I was like, oh well, of course Jesus has a greater relationship with the Father than we do because like he and the Father like were one or whatever. And it's like, so I was like, well, that's an advantage, right? And he's like, no, the same relationship that Jesus had with the Father is available to us through the Spirit and through faith in the Word. And I was like, what? And I'm like, this is too much for me right now. Like, I don't know, like just realizing that Jesus really didn't have any advantage over us at all, like was just kind of mind-blowing to me because like I always thought that he did, and I was like, oh well, yeah, of course he was able to live the life that he lived. He had all these advantages, like he was God and like blah 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 blah.
It's almost like Jesus meant it, when he said that he who believes in me will do the works that I do. Just a thought.
Here we thought he was being cheeky.
So one of the questions I also asked during the worship was like, so like then was Jesus born with a sinful nature? And because like that's a question, and they were like, well, what is a sinful nature? And I was like, a propensity to sin. And he's like, well, where does that come from? I'm like, well, we were born into it. And he's like, okay, but like how are you born into it? I'm like, from our ancestors. Like I don't know, like when I think of like what a sinful nature is, like I'm like I think of like some mystical like dark like orb inside of my chest somewhere that's like a sinful nature. I don't know, like I never really thought about like what it actually is, right? And he was explaining like the sinful nature is just being like without the spirit, right? So you're just left with the flesh, and the flesh has decayed from Adam and Eve in the garden, right? Because they were genetically perfect, and like there's like this decay curve of our genes where like they used to be super healthy and tall and like would live for 900 years, and now we're like have all sorts of sicknesses and like birth defects, and like we live to be maybe 80 years old, like because like the genetic, it decays, right? So he's like, now instead of having the spirit to guide us, all we have is the flesh and its passions and desires and appetites and whatever that guides us, because we were born without the spirit, right? So Jesus was born into the same body with the same genetic decay and like tendencies and like the generational curses from our parents and everything, but he was also born with spirit that we were not, right? Because he was born and conceived by the Spirit, born with the Spirit inside. So that's the only advantage that he had, was that he was born with Spirit where we were not. However, when we become born again and we are filled with the Spirit, now there's no difference between us and what Jesus had, right? And like when I realized that, I was like, yo, like it was just so like much for me. And I was just like, so literally when we become born again, we become like how Jesus was born. And now there's no difference in us in him. So we need to stop like placing ourselves in like this position of lack and inferiority, because that's unbelief, when belief is what enabled Jesus to live the way that he did.
Wow.
Yeah, something
That's
he's been
crazy.
showing me lately regarding faith is, because he's got me right now in a very uncomfortable place. But he was saying, he's like, you have the faith of the Father. You are given the faith of the Father. So he's like, so why are you only withdrawing pennies of it? Because he said, picture a bank account. He says it's literally a bank account full of, as much riches as you could possibly imagine and more. And you're just withdrawing and living on a couple pennies. And like when he painted that picture, I was just like, wow, like we really don't use faith to the extent that we can.
Yeah. And here's another thought that I had. I was like, okay, if my preconceived idea of like Jesus and God sitting up in heaven having a powwow about like their plan and like how he's going to come, I was like, why would they need to go, like, why would he need to be born through a woman and be raised as an infant? Like, why couldn't he just like beam himself down as a human and then do all the same stuff he did, right? If it was just about saving us and being a sacrifice, right? If it was just about coming to earth, doing miracles to get people to believe in him and like dying on the cross to save us from our sins, he could have just beamed himself down as an adult, right? But that's not what it was about. It was about him having the faith where we didn't have the faith. Because think about it, him being born through a woman, like he would have no way of knowing like that he was any different than any other human except through his faith and belief and like reading the word and agreeing with the Spirit that confirmed it to him, right? Does that make sense?
I was just thinking that exact same thing myself.
It's necessary for him to be born of a woman so that he wouldn't know that he was different or special, because if he knew, that would require no faith. And that makes me think like that's why sometimes we don't get answers right away, like we don't know what's going to happen, because it would require no faith, and I'm just like I keep realizing more and more like faith is actually everything, and it just keeps blowing my mind. So
Well, it's the currency of heaven.
yeah, I just like every new layer that I peel back, I'm just like, what? So
Think about
like, huh?
think in this context of what you've been discussing here, like how much faith Jesus had, to dig into the word and discover like, wow, these prophecies are actually about me, Think about the faith and the courage that it took young Jesus, who at that point had, I don't know if he had done any miracles yet at this point or not, but when he, in the synagogue, read that passage from Isaiah that said, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach the good news to the captives, the recovery of sight to the blind, and all that stuff, right? The year of the Lord's favor. He read it, and then immediately after he read it, he said, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing.
That's crazy.
And they got mad at him. They were like, this guy is Joseph's son. Like, who does he think he is? And he had to have known.
I want to read something
that way.
That Skylar, you mentioned. We were talking about this before, me and Skylar, and he helped me find some verses. Hebrews 11:6. I'm not going to take the time for you guys just to turn there because I have to get going. But Hebrews 11:6 says, without faith, it is impossible to please God. Right? And we know that when Jesus took the step of faith to be baptized, what did God say?
This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased.
Right, in whom I'm well pleased. But it's impossible to please God without faith. So it's like God was smiling upon the faith of Jesus. Like, and that's just crazy. Like,
Yeah.
That's just so awesome. We already talked about the devil tempting with the if you are the Son of God, so we can skip that. Let's look at Galatians 2:20. Skylar, do you want to read it, or is it readily available to you?
Yeah, hold on. Panic, finding Bible verse quickly. Galatians
2:20.
20. So what you're going to get at actually is not revealed in my translation.
Well,
so you should probably, okay. So Galatians 2:20, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. The life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me.
Right. So his version says faith in the Son of God. Other versions say faith of the Son of God. So can you just read that one part but change it to of, Sky?
Yeah, sure. So the life I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me.
Yeah, there's lots of examples of that, like in Bible verses where, like, probably because the people that are translating it don't have this concept, so they're like, well, it's faith in Jesus, right? But no, it's really like the faith of Jesus that is what saves, right? We're saved through his faith, right? Like, it's not even about our faith. Like, it is, but that's not what saves us. Our faith isn't what saves us. It was his faith that saved us, and us just, like, accepting that is, like, that's it. Like, and it's just, like, because we can easily turn faith into another work, right? We'd be like, oh, well, we have to, like, do all this good stuff, or, like, not break any commandments or not sin in order to be saved, right? But if we're also believe that we're saved by our own faith, then we can turn faith into a work and be like, oh, well, I have to drum up all this faith so that I'm saved. You see what I'm saying? Like, when it was never about our faith, because we failed. Like, Adam failed in faith. So Jesus had to come and have faith where we didn't. And it's just, it's so good.
Yeah, I'm looking through Bible Hub. You guys are welcome to do the same if you want, but Bible Hub is a great resource for any of y'all that haven't used it before if you ever want to compare multiple translations side by side. So yeah, there are a bunch that say in, and there are a bunch that say the. So probably the most like classic one that says the is the King James Version, right? It says, the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God. And there are several others that say the same. So for what it's worth.
I want to read something here also. This is Philippians 2, 5 and 6. And I'm just going to read it here. Philippians 2, 5 and 6 says, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing. Some versions say he emptied himself by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And I read that, and it's like talking about like how he did not use his divine nature of God to his advantage. And I'm like, it's literally in there. Like, if I had just read the Bible. No, I have read the Bible. That's why I'm so like annoyed with myself that like I've read the Bible cover to cover and like somehow missed all of these things like all my life, you know? That just shows how much our presuppositions like affect us. Like, it filters how we read and interpret things, you know? So I think it's so cool. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
So one of the ministers / men of God, men and women of God who have made a big difference in my life, I might have mentioned him once or twice in our group chat, is a guy named Curry Blake. And one question I heard him ask one time, I was like, wow, that's a great point. He said, as you read the Gospels, you know, the story of Jesus walking around on the earth doing things, who do you identify with? Like, who do you picture yourself as in the story? Do you picture yourself as, you know, the woman at the well, the woman taken in adultery, the person who's sick, you know, laying by the pool? Do you picture yourself as, you know, just someone who's in the crowd watching what's happening? Do you picture yourself as one of the disciples? And Curry Blake was like, the person you should picture yourself as is Jesus.
And isn't that crazy? Because like religion would tell you that that's like blasphemy and heretical to consider yourself like that way.
Right.
But Second Peter 1 verse 3 and 4 literally says his divine power has given us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and goodness. Through these, he has given us his very great and precious promises so that we can participate in the divine nature, having escaped the corruption of the world and its evil desires.
Wow.
Yeah.
So,
Now, obviously, there will be people who hear this message and immediately object, right? Because, like you said earlier, they'll think that we're lowering Jesus and raising ourselves on an unscriptural or heretical level. But it simply isn't the case, because we're not diminishing the divinity of Christ. We're not saying that we are sons or daughters in the same way that Jesus was, because we were not conceived by the Holy Spirit. Like, we're not part of we're not members of the triune Godhead. But God's seed has filled us and birthed in us new life of the same kind that Jesus demonstrated on the earth. He was the prototype. He was the first new man, and now we are new men and women. He was the firstborn among many brothers. So there's a nuance there. Yes, he was in a class on his own in the sense that he's part of the Godhead, but there's also a lot less space between us and him than traditional Christianity would have us think.
right, I'm not saying like I'm God. But
Right.
a good metaphor is that, like, you have a husband and wife, right? They become one flesh. So they're one, but they're still apart, right? They're still different beings. It's like Jesus is a part of me, but he's still a part, right? Like, I'm not him. Does that make sense? But like, we're still one. Like in a marriage, like, you become one. We have complete intimacy with him because he's living inside you. So he's part of who you are, right? Your life is hidden in Christ. That's biblical. It says we're co-heirs with Christ, that he considers us brothers and sisters, right? But it's like we've been adopted in, but not that we're of the same essence of him and God. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
What were you going to say, Ben?
So back in Genesis, God says that he created us in his image. And so that would indicate to me that, so someone creates a statue of some great historical person. That statue carries the person's likeness, just in body. But obviously humans are more than statues. They're actually like living beings. And in the Gospels, the religious leaders constantly were like, oh, Jesus is committing blasphemy by saying that he's God's son. Obviously, we aren't, like, by saying that he's equal with God and God's son. Obviously, we're not saying that we are equal with God, but I think that whole concept of people saying that it's blasphemy or almost blasphemy to, I guess, accept that new identity and to see ourselves as more. I don't know.
Well, those are people. These are the same people that don't believe that freedom from sin is possible, and then it's impossible for us to walk and live like Jesus did. So they have to construct these ways to justify that. But one other thing I wanted to bring up was the concept of Jesus as the high priest, which is throughout Hebrews. Hebrews 4:14. It says, like, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet he did not sin. That's basically what you were saying, Ben. And like, this completely destroys the idea that he had an advantage over us. Because if he had an advantage over us and he had all this power that he was born with, and he like knew who he was, and he was like undercover, then like he could not represent us if he had an advantage over us, right? The high priest was representative of the people, right? He literally was a representative of them. So Jesus couldn't be our representative if he was like way up here and we're like down here, right? Because then it wouldn't even have been fair. It wouldn't have been a fair representation. So there's, yes, Skylar.
There's a verse I thought of, which relates somewhat, definitely relates to what Ben was saying. It relates to what you were saying too. 2 Corinthians 3, start at verse 17. You'll see what I mean. Now, the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image.
Yeah.
Same image, from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord who is the Spirit.
Mic drop.
Yeah, no, I did a devotion months back, and I can't remember what limited beliefs I was dealing with, but I remember just like God saying to me, picture yourself saying that about Jesus. Could you accept it? And I said, no. He said, so why are you accepting it for yourself?
Yeah.
Wow.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
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 So moral of the story is the only thing holding us back from living the way Jesus did is our unbelief.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying we're supposed to be like Jesus?
Yes, Skylar. That's what Christian means, apparently. That's what apparently it means to be a Christian. And following Jesus, literally, that's what that means. So.
And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "Be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect."
Yeah. See, people will say that and be like, oh, well, he didn't really mean that. He meant like, metaphorically. And I'm like,
Be
did he
imitators of God as beloved children.
Yeah. So this was a huge mind-blowing moment for me. I don't know if it was for you guys, because some of you guys seem to already like know this already, but like it was a huge game changer for me. I was like, so you're saying I can literally have the same relationship with the Father that Jesus had. I can live the same way that Jesus did. I can like literally do the same powers and stuff, like because he just got that miracles, whatever, because he did that through faith that who he believed that he was through the Father. And so I'm like just sitting here like, oh my gosh, literally the only thing that's been holding me back has been like my lack of believing it. And I'm like,
well, and the other thing about it too, Grace, is that it's not like the history of Christianity is absent of examples of people who have gotten this. Like, yeah, you won't hear about it in most of the mainstream, just bland religious Christian churches today. But like, there have been people who have walked in power throughout the history of the church. Like, there have been resurrections and incredible healings and extraordinary miracles. Like, it's not like the power of God has been absent on the earth. It's just been that people haven't believed in it, haven't looked for it. And then when they've heard testimonies about things that have happened, they usually have been like, I don't know if that's real or not. I'd have to see the doctor's report to really believe that.
Yeah.
Like, but this, like, people have gotten a hold of this and been like, wow, I can do this too. And they've done it. Like, so it's not like the word, God backs up his word. Like when someone says, I believe that, and I'm not going to settle for anything less than that, it begins to manifest in their lives.
Massively powerful when you can stand on scripture and just know it in the core of your being, because it shifts your life unbelievably.
Yeah. Anyways, I appreciate you guys bearing with me and letting me share this with you. I am going to go to lunch, so I'm going to make someone else the host. If you guys want to stay in chat, that's totally fine. But I have to go so I don't miss my lunch. Okay?
Enjoy your sandwich.